try and share my screen before I say anything else. Okay. Okay, so hopefully that's worked. You're all seeing my PowerPoint now? Okay.
Yes.
I'll do full screen. Yes, so thank you for that lovely introduction, and also just for having me, and also to all the listeners for being here. It's a pleasure for me, despite the kind of slightly strange circumstances of doing it virtually, like all things these days. With that in mind, I'm going to try and keep the talk really accessible and punctuate it with some clips and trailers regularly. Hopefully it'll be a relatively light relief. I think we all need a little bit of comedy at this time. Otherwise, the talking part is about 45 minutes. And as you know, we'll have time for some Q&A afterwards. And for the lecture, as it were, the structure is going to be roughly as follows. I'll start off by saying something about the French film industry and the place of comedy within it. And that's not something that typically comes on the radar that much when looking at texts at school level. And actually, in my opinion, not always enough at university either. But it is appropriate, I think, for cinema specifically as a mass medium, which is propelled by demand. You need bums on seats in the cinema, or maybe the home movie, as it were, theatre lately, to fund those big budgets involved in filmmaking. So saleability is a consideration in a way that isn't really true of literature, for example, when it comes to film. Then I'm going to focus a bit more fully on the substance of the three films under consideration today, Intouchable, Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait au bon Dieu, and Bienvenue chez les Ch'tis, as examples of different comic subgenres, such as the fish out of water comedy of culture clash, and in particular the buddy comedy, and what these might represent in a French generic but also social context. Interrogating generic identity leads then on to the question of identity politics at the level of characterization in all the films. Evidently, they raise issues of gender because they are focused on male friendships, buddy comedies by definition, but also other identity issues, including most obviously perhaps class ones across all three films, as well as racial ones in Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait au bon Dieu and Intouchable especially. In the last 10 or 15 minutes of the talk, I'm going to home in on the latter film, Intouchable, as a case study for thinking about the benefits or limitations of representing inter-ethnic relations, specifically through a humorous lens in contemporary France. So bringing some close visual analysis to complement the contextual considerations. Okay. So starting with the French film industry, I sometimes ask students what they think of when they think of French cinema as a kind of icebreaker. And usually, at least some people talk about things like realism or drama or seriousness, perhaps even the new wave, although maybe a bit less so now. It's getting further and further in the past, but still an important reference point. So gestures towards the idea of it being a kind of art cinema. And of course, that's true, but I like to convey that that's not the whole story. Tim Palmer's work is useful here. He's written about the paradoxes of French cinema, and specifically the way, yes, it's a subsidized art form, but it's also a vigorous industry, a field with intellectual ambitions also courting widespread popularity. And he goes on in the same vein and also mentions something of the transnational reach of mainstream French cinema, as well as art cinema exporting around the globe and even to America, as he says. So yes, French cinema is quite heavily subsidized due to being considered a serious art form by the state, particularly through the system of avance sur recette for less profitable films. So this is money given to filmmakers, which is later offset against takings. But if you don't do well, you don't have to pay that money back. So it really helps débutant auteurs, smaller budget films. But it's also a huge commercial player, and this is often less visible outside of France, despite the fact that it does well at home, but also in the international film market sometimes, as exemplified by at least two of today's films. I'll talk more about that later. More generally, French cinema is at the present time booming. So Tim Palmer gives this chart going up to 2009. And if you look particularly at the right-hand column of 100% French financed films, you can see the numbers just going up and up. And actually that trend does continue. And if you want to find out more statistics, you can have a look at the website given at the bottom for the CNC, the Centre National de la Cinématographie et de l'Image Animée, it's called, which has a wealth of data. Palmer also notes that investment in French cinema has more than tripled over that same period, which is quite important, I think. Of course, things like cinema actually do quite well in periods of financial crisis and sort of other challenging times like war. Pandemic may be another matter, but it has continued to do well broadly. It's interesting to take a random year and think about which French films are in the overall top 20 for the domestic market for the year. So I did this with 2009, the year that Palmer finishes on. And if you look at those French films that are in the top 20 at the French box office in 2009, many of them are comedies. So all the ones I've highlighted there. The other two, we have a heritage biopic about Chanel and a animated family film by Luc Besson, Arthur et la Vengeance de Balthazar. But yes, the other four are comedies, as you would get a sense of if you have a look at their posters. I won't spend much time on that, but perhaps the most interesting one for our purposes today is Neuilly sa mère, which is a fish out of water comedy of culture clash about a boy from an underprivileged banlieue moving to the posh banlieue of Neuilly-sur-Mer. It's actually rather indebted to the TV show The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, if any of you know that. So this fish out of water comedy idea is really popular in France, perhaps because it's a country with some big social divides and lots of quite varied identities contained within it. Including different ethnic identities, coming from the fact that France has historically had very high immigration, as you will know probably, but no harm going back to this. It's relied on agriculture quite a bit and needed to attract a big workforce from outside to work the land. And so at different times, it's invited people to come from other countries, especially countries which it used to rule over as part of its empire, notably in various parts of Africa. So regarding culture clash plot lines, in fact, if you look at a list of the most profitable films released in France since 2000, this includes American cinema as well, you'll find that all the French ones in the top 5, so leaving aside Avatar, are actually forms of fish out of water comedy, including, as well as an Asterix movie where he goes to Egypt, all 3 of the films we're looking at today. Now, I imagine quite a few people have probably seen these, but maybe not everyone. So I'll just say something to remind us or to familiarize ourselves with them and sort of evidence my claims about them, focusing on culture clashes. So in reverse order, Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait au bon Dieu is Serial Bad Weddings in English, and it focuses on a very traditional Catholic couple with 4 daughters. At the beginning of the film, the backstory is that one of their daughters has married a Chinese man, one has married a Jew, and one has married a man of North African extraction. And they're very pleased when their 4th daughter says that she's marrying a Catholic man, and then she reveals that he's black, right? So a pretty unpolitically correct comedy focusing on sort of difficult topics, perhaps, but with this really broad, humorous lens, perhaps a little bit surprising. Intouchable is the unlikely tale of friendship between a very rich paraplegic named Philippe and his carer, black carer Driss from the impoverished Parisian banlieue. As for Bienvenue chez les Ch'tis, it's about postal workers, but I thought for this one we might actually watch a trailer. Some of the aspects of its comedy are quite hard to describe, and also why not? It's the highest grossing French film of all time in France, and it's actually the 2nd highest grossing film overall in France ever, with only Titanic having beaten it still. So let's have a look at this trailer. Hopefully this will work with sound and everything.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
J'ai une bonne et une mauvaise nouvelle.
Viré.
Pire encore.
Pire que viré, c'est quoi?
T'es muté dans le Nord.
Le Nord? Non. À Lyon?
Pas à Lyon, dans le Nord.
Me dis pas qu'ils m'envoient à Paris.
Pas à Paris.
Dis donc, je suis en train de regarder Sanary-sur-Mer et les apparts fabuleux. Pas traîner pour visiter, hein?
Rassure-toi, on n'y va plus.
C'est pas possible.
Non, mais attends, on m'a proposé autre chose de bien plus intéressant.
Où ça?
Où ça? À Burg.
Dur.
Et il fait très froid.
Oh. En été, ça va, parce que tu as 0, 0,1. Mais l'hiver, ça descend. Moins 10, moins 20, moins 30. C'est le Nord.
Avec la mer du Nord pour dernier terrain vague, des vagues de dunes pour arrêter les vagues. et de vagues rochers.
Vous êtes arrivé à destination.
Oh mon Dieu! Ça va? Vous n'êtes pas mort?
Bienvenue, monsieur le directeur.
Monsieur Bayeul?
Vous avez reconnu à votre plaque les 13. Ici, c'est 59. Vous avez fait signe d'arrêter votre carrette, mais vous m'avez pas vu. Mais ça va, j'ai rien.
Votre mâchoire, vous êtes baissé là?
Hein?
Vous avez mal quand vous parlez là, non?
Quoi?
Votre mâchoire, ça va là?
Non, j'ai rien, Juice.
Ah, je vous assure, vous vous exprimez d'une façon très très particulière. Hein.
Parce que je m'ai acheté, c'est ça?
C'est pas meublé?
Ah bah, l'ancien directeur, il est parti avec, hein.
Pourquoi il est parti avec les meubles?
Parce que j'ai peut-être les chiens.
Quel chien?
Les meubles.
Et pourquoi donner ces meubles à des chiens?
Mais non, les chiens, pour les chiens. Ils ont pas donné à des chiens, chez meubles, il est parti avec.
Mais pourquoi vous dites qu'il les a donnés?
Mais j'ai jamais dit chats.
Pourquoi des chats? Vous m'avez dit des chiens.
Les chiens à lui.
Ah, les siens, pas les chiens! Les siens!
Ouais, les chiens, c'est ça.
Les chiens, les chats, putain, mais tout le monde parle comme vous ici!
Great. Okay. So you will have noticed some desperate attempts to translate the untranslatable jokes there if you followed the French and the English subtitles. I'll say more about the culture clash elements of that trailer and the whole film later. But I want for now to underline another aspect of all three films' generic identity, and that's their simultaneous status as buddy films. What do I mean by that? Well, the buddy comic duo has a long history. Buddy duos are an archetype of many narratives from all over the civilized world, going back at least as far as the Commedia dell'arte pictured in the middle there. As you all know, this refers to traveling European theatre troupes in the 16th to 18th century. And I've given a random selection of other examples from 17th century Spanish literature, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, to early cinema, Laurel and Hardy, and then a more recent Hollywood movie from the 1980s, Lethal Weapon, with Mel Gibson and Danny Glover. So they are persistent and recurrent. However, they do have a particular history in France and in French cinema specifically as well. Here is just one among many examples I could have chosen. The film Les Ripoux, which is about cops who are corrupt. So in Verlan, the pourri becomes Ripoux. And this is actually a very common paradigm there as well. And Raphaël Moine, in her work on remakes in French cinema, looking at films that are remade into Hollywood movies, finds, in fact, that buddy movies are much more common in the French cinematic landscape even than in Hollywood historically. For example, one finding was that there are many fewer romantic comedies historically in France. So that was a genre in which women did feature, relatively unusual. Women have tended to be quite excluded from good roles, as it were, in cinema in general, and perhaps particularly in France because of the prevalence of the buddy film. So she didn't find very many remakes of rom-coms, and when she did, they were usually kind of slightly more focused on a buddy dynamic in the original French one, and then the female parts were expanded in the American remakes. My own work, as Davina was talking about, is examining when romantic comedies do begin to flourish in France, which wasn't really until the 90s and into this millennium. Still, even if they do have a certain specificity in France, I think that transnational recognizability of the buddy generic affiliation has helped these films' international success. And this is particularly true of Bienvenue chez les Stym, which did well in many European countries, also spawned some remakes, for example, in Italy. There's another that was promised from the US to be produced, perhaps starring as well Will Smith, but that doesn't materialize, or not yet. It's also, and even more so, true of Intouchable, which took $10 million in the USA and over $400 million worldwide, as well as engendering its own remake, The Upside, with Bryan Cranborne and Kevin Hart, which was also quite profitable, although not the huge blockbuster of the original. It's interesting to consider why Intouchable was so very popular outside France. As we've seen, Bienvenue chez les Stym was perhaps slightly limited by the difficulty of translating the verbal humor. Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait au bon Dieu is arguably also pretty specific in terms of its meaningfulness for a French audience. For example, the North African character isn't sort of so recognizable to international audiences, certainly not in America. There's a different situation, arguably, with Intouchable, where the simple white man, black man pairing is familiar to global audiences accustomed to Hollywood fare. Looking here at our slide, we can cite the early example of Lethal Weapon. That's a franchise from the 80s, very successful, but also lots of successes, perhaps most notably Men in Black. Indeed, a scholar called David Peterson has argued precisely this, that aspect of the film made it easy to export to America. And he talks about the way in which lots of American reviews pointed out similarities specifically between the star of Intouchable, Omar Sy, who plays Driss, and the African-American actor and comedian Eddie Murphy in particular, as well as some other comedians. If the younger viewers are not sure who Eddie Murphy is, from older films like Trading Places or Beverly Hills Cop, or not even perhaps as the star of Daddy Daycare from 2003, perhaps they might know him better as the voice of the donkey in Shrek. But anyway, a star of immense stature. But I'm going to come back to race and also to this very interesting article by David Peterson, which raises a few different points of relevance and pertinence a bit later on. Because I think even a snapshot of the buddy dynamic foregrounds ways in which it's an interesting genre for thinking first about representing gendered identity and warrants a little bit of attention. You can see from that image that I've picked one that has a certain phallic symbolism fairly prominent within it. I think this speaks nicely to the way in which buddy dynamics have often been theorized as deliberately excluding women, and very often there's a sense that one of the male characters replaces a woman, so is slightly more feminized. So in a way, reproducing a kind of romance-like dynamic, that being a story form that's incredibly popular and recurrent, but with two men. This is very much the case with Lethal Weapon. For people who've seen that, you may recall Mel Gibson carrying Danny Glover when he's injured and kind of weeping at the start of the first movie. Also, lots of other films like Top Gun or Point Break have that one more feminized star of the duo in the foreground. The homoerotic potentialities of this setup tend to be disavowed in these films by overt and indeed showy sexism. Perhaps a good example, reasonably recent example here might be Judd Apatow films such as Knocked Up. They're discussed by John Alberti in his book on masculinity and contemporary romantic comedy. So I'm talking here about a group of buddies rather than just two. And you may recall if you've seen that film, so those are all friends of the main character played by Seth Rogen in Knocked Up, as I say. And they are a very kind of backward and rather hostile group of men. And they're almost parodic in their misogyny. For example, they are planning a business where they're going to catalogue lots of mainstream films as to where you can see scantily clad women in them. So how many minutes in you get the boob shot and so on. So that's their business plan. Also, I think they look pretty hostile in this picture opening into the door, because they've actually all got pink eye because they've been farting on their hands. So this very kind of Arrested Development storyline, but it makes them look very aggressive. And in that case, you know, that is actually a romantic comedy. So his films, Judd Apatow's films, have been seen as kind of hijacking romantic comedy, and even in that more feminized genre, tending to sideline women slightly in favor of a focus on male friendships. I think it's not too difficult to see where we get this type of thing in today's films. Bienvenue chez les Ch'tis was criticized for its absence of complex female roles. The largest one goes to the perennially sunny and carefree Annabelle on the left in the top image, readily won over by Danny Boon's Antoine from a rival suitor, and altogether redolent of a fairy tale maiden. While elsewhere a nagging, neurotic wife, seen in the trailer, and an overbearing mother, here on the right, played by veteran actress Line Renaud, are well-established comic staples and reductive and negative ones. Regarding Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait au bon Dieu, in the bottom image, it's noteworthy that the black and white patriarchs, fathers of the main couple pictured there, finally only bond over shared irritation about the needs of their quote-unquote annoying wives. Okay, so here are some references saying more or less what I've just gone over in a bit more detail. But also, I wanted to give you that image of Intouchable, which I think evokes the way its misogyny speaks for itself. As one points out, here too we have a situation of male complicity in subordinating women. So when Driss flirts with Philippe's attractive assistant Magali in the interview at the beginning, he finally makes Philippe smile and warm to him. Later, key female roles include East Asian masseuses come prostitutes in a fashion you would be unlikely to find in a mainstream Hollywood movie, I think. I'll be a bit more brief on the question of class identity, as this is less foregrounded in these films, in line with common perceptions about the decline of class identity as such in contemporary France. However, Moine has argued that regional difference in Bienvenue is actually an alibi for class difference. You may remember, for example, that the southerner, snobby southerner, doesn't want to eat at the baraque à frites for his lunch break, which is a kind of shack, chip shack, street food as it were, although in the end it's delicious. He wants a more kind of fine dining sit-down experience. And there are many ways in which questions of class intersect with the more ostentatiously foregrounded race issues in both the other two films. So in this picture of Intouchable, we see a picture of the banlieue from whence Driss hails as a multi-ethnic, but also certainly lower class milieu, very obviously contrasted with Philippe's wealthy world. And strangely, we have chips as the focal point again, which I didn't plan, but it seems, you know, peculiarly French to use food as a marker of class in that way. So they're sharing some chips there. By way of a bridge to thinking about race, it's also useful to note that considering how the dynamic of jokes about difference works on any of these identity questions, class, race, or gender, applies to all of them. So to take the example of bienvenue and sublimated class difference, on the one hand, we can see the film as a positive fable suggesting a blueprint for how to get on with others, capital O, and dispelling fear about the lower class industrial milieu of northern France, while confronting a middle class cinema-going audience with its own prejudices. And that's the key joke in the film, right? The snobbery about the North. On the other hand, the film has to cite certain stereotypes about the region in order to hold them up to scrutiny, if not mockery. And in reproducing them, it at least partially reinforces them. For instance, it does rain immediately when he appears in the North in the trailer. People speak in incomprehensible ways that were wildly exaggerated for the film, to the consternation of people who live in that part of France. And elsewhere, Boone's character does drink rather a lot and also eat plenty of low-grade food, even if these activities are presented as agreeable. And this is the same tension outlined by Ginette Vincendot at the level of race, in particular, in a piece where she describes these films as comedies of ethnic integration, in which identity is affirmed and exaggerated stereotypically, provoking conflicts that are then resolved in a tale of social harmony. It's worth noting en passant here the way in which this racial issue has tended to attract more attention than the other identitarian ones in these films, no doubt due to the acute status of racial tensions in contemporary France. It's helpful to think here perhaps briefly about the assimilationist policy there, so where difference has to be shrugged off in order to become French, in the model of égalité. Example would be the banning of the hijab, the Muslim veil in schools, which caused controversy some years ago. And of course, France has arguably become emblematic of a certain kind of Western rigidity that Islamic fundamentalists have taken against, and therefore it's sadly become the victim of multiple terrorist attacks, including another one very recently. So might these films have something to offer beyond mere escapism in this situation? To demonstrate further what Ginette Vincendot means by the comedy of ethnic integration, I think we should watch our second clip here from Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait au bon Dieu? And this is taken from a point in the film, Christmas time, where the three existing son-in-laws have gone to stay with their in-laws, and we see the men all bonding on Christmas Eve. Okay.
Oh, Toi, t'as des soucis?
Ah non, non, pas du tout, ça va. Ça va, maman, ça va bien.
On va tout faire.
Moi, quand je regarde un match de foot de l'équipe de France, à chaque fois que j'entends la Marseillaise, j'ai des frissons.
Ah oui? Moi aussi, Claude, hein. J'ai le poil qui se dresse.
Et pareil. Et pourtant, je déteste le foot.
On me fait marcher. Vous la connaissez au moins, la Marseillaise? Puisque d'habitude, les joueurs d'origine...
Allons, enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé. Contre nous de la tyrannie, l'étendard sanglant élevé. L'étendard sanglant élevé. Entendez-vous dans vos campagnes mugir ces féroces soldats qui viennent jusque dans vos bras, égorger vos fils, vos compagnes. Programme citoyens, formez vos bataillons. Marchons, marchons, qu'un sang impur abreuve nos sillons. Tintanin.
Il foutu le frisson.
Je voulais dire, David, si tu voulais passer à la banque pour que j'étudie ton affaire de téléphone vintage, enfin, tu...
Non, mais j'ai laissé tomber. Ça fait 3 ans que j'ai pas trouvé d'investisseur. Non, je crois que c'était vraiment complètement de la merde. Par contre, je suis sur un gros coup, là.
Hein?
Ouais. T'es prêt?
Ouais.
Cachère bio.
Ah, mais pourquoi tu lui fais les yeux bridés, là? C'est un bonhomme de neige, pas Bouddha.
Mais il a pas les yeux bridés, là. Ah, si.
T'as raison, un bonhomme de neige noix, ça n'existe pas. Si c'est ça, moi, dans ce cas-là, je lui une pas.
Bah, moi, je lui mets une barbe, y a pas de raison.
Petite bataille?
Sérieux?
Ouais.
Avec un robeux. T'es un ouf, toi.
Non, il fait froid, les gars, non.
Allez, c'est parti.
Ah bah putain.
C'est bien.
Attends, d'abord, lui d'abord, lui.
Bah, vas-y.
Vas-y, je te dis, vas-y.
Vas-y, qu'est-ce qu'il y a?
Vas-y, allez.
Allahu Akbar.
Alors. Oh.
C'est pas bien grave, Rachid, ça lui rappelle sa jeunesse, n'est-ce pas, Claude?
Oui, c'est excellent.
Nous venions vous chercher, Chao. Nous partons à la messe.
J'arrive.
Oui. Oui, bon, bah, je vais...
C'est pas grave. Tu vas à la messe, toi?
Bah ouais, les gars, faut être ouvert.
Ah, le nouache. Suce-boule en chef, quoi.
Great. So I think you can see there what Vincent means by social harmony, but also coloured by variety, resumed in that image of the snowman. Yet at the same time, we do have that citation of stereotypes. So the Chinaman is the lèche-cul, the Jew is the canny business strategist, and the North African is portrayed as wild and, troublingly, even allied with extreme religious zeal, as he inexplicably shouts Allah Akbar, or God is great, before hurling his snowball. Now, stereotypes are arguably particularly necessary in the mainstream visual format of film comedy, as much as anything as a kind of shorthand for the limited feature film timeframe. But is it worth it? For Stuart Hall, there's a price of incorporation to be paid when the cutting edge of difference is blunted into spectacularization, those kind of caricatural views. One way to complexify the answer to this, or to maybe salvage a positive, might reside in comedy itself and the importance of structural dynamics of address in joke situations, as described by Freud, in terms of who's laughing at or with whom. And I want now to take Omar Sy's character as a case study for this, both in Intouchable and outside of it. Starting with the film itself, it's important to note that while Intouchable is based on a true story, as its ending reveals, one key difference is, of course, the ethnicity of the Dries character, since in the real duo, the carer was North African. When asked about this in an interview, the directors Nakash and Toledano have said that they weren't trying to make any special statement through this change, through choosing a black actor. They just wanted to use Omar Sy because they had worked with him before. And there's certainly no doubt some truth in this. This is the film where he'd starred or featured, which is called Tellement Proche in French. Actually, it's more of a minor role despite his prominence in that poster. And he's mainly included for laughs. He plays a doctor who's repeatedly mistaken for a cleaner in the hospital where he works, to his exasperation, in a detail that recognizes the fact that ethnic minorities, and especially Black people in France, suffer social prejudice and are uncommon in higher status jobs. So this might seem quite woke or politically aware about race. On the other hand, the film really just plays the running gag for laughs, which speaks to these interesting questions about what's it appropriate to laugh about. That is, are we laughing with prejudiced people or at them? What it certainly shows, however, is that the directors recognize that visually raced or racialized appearances and identities are meaningful and that different ones have particular and varied associations. And indeed, they enormously amp up visual oppositions in Intouchable in a way that does speak to the notion of reductive caricature and stereotype, arguably. So an exercise I like to do sometimes with students, particularly in first year, or sometimes I've done it with school students as well, visiting workshops and things, is to think about the specifics of how these oppositions are set up. So you can talk, for example, about the spaces in the film, very obviously, I think. It's a good way to bring in questions of mise en scène, composition, lighting. You can see that the banlieue is very dark on the whole. The images are quite cluttered, the top two in particular. Sense of frustration in the top right image, not being able to see, claustrophobia. Bottom left image I think is interesting because it uses speeded up photography and dissolves to suggest kind of the half-life, the ghostly existence of the banlieue. And the bottom right image is a very kind of cliched classic one of this space. You see it in La Haine as well. See my previous talk or books about La Haine by Vincent Doe has written a great critical guide to these geometric patterns reproducing themselves. And we only ever see the cité, the ugly part of the banlieue, when in fact there are all kinds of other zones pavillonnaires and more attractive parts. So the contrast with the presentation of Paris is very strong. We have lighter images, evidence of intellectual culture in the top left image, is a librairie in the background, but also very classical framing and balanced compositions in those two images, top right and at the bottom. If we look at Driss's house, again, we have clutter, use of architectural frames inside the frame to further suggest enclosure. Again, frustration. And not the balanced composition. So the left-hand images, especially, the eye isn't drawn to the center of the frame in the same way. We're not sure where to look. It's more chaotic and busy mise en scène. Sometimes I like to talk about the Philippe's house. It sort of speaks for itself. The top image looks, I mean, both of them really look like they're in an interior design magazine, and the bottom one is quite interesting, and having that curtain as if it was a sort of theatre curtain, you know, gesturing perhaps to the staged and constructed nature of this aesthetic show. Sometimes I like to talk about the beach at the end of the film, but I won't say much about it today because it's really an aside. But historical spaces of Dunkirk is an interesting choice, perhaps inserting the Black character into the history of France in some sense, but it's also often been seen as a very ambivalent space, a liminal space. And likewise, we don't really know what the ending is for Driss in this film. So there's a happy ending for Philippe, but it's much more open for Driss, which I think is interesting. But returning to oppositions, you can also talk about characterization, obviously, so between Philippe and Driss, but also between Driss and other characters like Magali, Yvonne. And an exercise I sometimes do is to look at Driss in relation to the other interview candidates in that scene near the beginning of the film, and think about how, so now not just kind of visual details, but audio-visual ones, so including editing, performance style, casting, delivery, dialogue, how those set up a situation where Driss seems much more positively presented and very contrasted overall with the other interview candidates. So maybe we just have a little look at that because it's quite a short extract to remind ourselves of that scene. It's not necessarily an easy exercise, it's a bit more subtle, a piece of analysis, because not all of them are kind of outright terrible or anything. So I'm having a problem with my mouse, there we go. I don't know if this is going to work. That's okay.
Vous avez des références?
Oui, donc moi je suis titulaire du CAFAD, le certificat d'aptitude aux fonctions d'aide à domicile.
Que j'ai fait valider pendant une formation en alternance à l'Institut Bayer, dans les Landes, en 2001.
D'abord, j'ai un bac pro, service de proximité et vie sociale, que j'ai poursuivi avec un BTS, économie sociale et familiale.
Enfin, j'ai plus fait d'études pour l'instant que travailler.
Quelle est votre principale motivation?
L'argent.
L'humain. Ah, moi, je suis à fond dans l'humain.
C'est bien.
C'est d'aider l'autre, je pense. C'est bon, ça, comme... Enfin, c'est bien, ça, comme...
J'aime bien le quartier.
J'aime beaucoup les gens diminués. Depuis tout petit, hein, tout petit.
C'est de favoriser l'autonomie des personnes handicapées, je dirais. C'est-à-dire leur insertion sociale.
Le sport également, hein, faut bouger, faut... Pour l'insertion dans la vie, quoi. C'est des personnes qui peuvent rien faire.
Et j'ai eu ma première vraie expérience professionnelle.
C'était Madame Dupont-Moretti.
Une très très vieille dame, très vieille.
Que j'ai assisté jusqu'à la fin, au quotidien.
Voilà, je me souviens en gériatrie, par exemple, il y a eu quand même des bons moments. On avait fait la galette, on avait fait...
Ah, je suis également expert dans tout ce qui concerne les démarches administratives.
L'APL notamment, l'aide au logement. Moi, je sais pas, peut-être vous en bénéficiez.
Vous vérifierez, Magali, mais je pense pas.
Okay, I'll leave it there. To move on to talking about Driss himself. So thinking about caricature and stereotype, Peterson is very useful here, and he picks out a number of ways in which Driss is stereotyped in a racialized fashion, and some of these were picked up on by reviews, particularly in the USA. So in the top left, we could see Driss as a kind of black mammy-like carer. Top right, the buffoon. Middle left, the sexualized black man. Middle right, the performer in general, in particular the expert dancer, the athlete. And that bottom image is really interesting. David Peterson argues that as he looms up out of the darkness, coming to help Philippe at night, he inadvertently, the characterization, the styling recalls blackface, so the minstrel tradition. And if students aren't aware of that, it can be useful to remind oneself and also to perhaps contemporize that a little bit by thinking about the unfortunate antics of the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau not too long ago. I think this kind of stereotyping does colour his roles subsequent to Intouchable as well, where they tend to continue being quite cliched. Films, you know, one of the films is called De l'autre côté du périphérique, which, you know, whose title immediately suggests stereotyping, that kind of spatial contrast again. Another film he did soon after Intouchable is a romantic comedy called Samba, and I'm just going to show you the trailer of that as well. So the last short clip.
Perdu son père mort il y a 10 ans dans un accident sur un chantier près de Dakar, Monsieur Samba Cissé a dû abandonner l'école, laisser sa mère et ses 2 sœurs pour venir en France et subvenir aux besoins de sa famille.
Passe le bonjour à tout le monde et puis tu leur dis que je vais bien. Avec mon copain. Oh, qu'est-ce que tu fous?
C'est quoi votre nom?
Samba Cissé. Samba, comme la danse. J'avais fait une demande des titres de séjour. Ils m'avaient déjà envoyé des réponses pour dire bon, comme quoi ils sont pas d'accord.
Mais nous, on va essayer de faire valoir vos droits et puis on va tenter de faire sortir d'ici.
Là, tu vas t'habiller autrement. Comme un homme d'affaires qui va au bureau.
Vous devez toujours rester discret.
Et au bout de combien de temps?
Au bout de 1 an.
Comment je vis, moi? Comment je fais avec le loyer? Il y a des gens qui comptent sur moi.
J'ai besoin de 10 manœuvres sur un chantier.
C'est un amour à moi. Oui, c'est vrai.
Tu connais la pub Coca-Cola?
Quoi? Mais arrête de faire ça.
Travaillons maintenant. C'est fini, Coca, la terminé. Retournez travailler, c'est fini.
Merci Alice pour tout ce que vous faites pour moi.
Faut garder la distance, parce qu'après, ça peut vraiment faire mal s'ils sont renvoyés.
Alors, on se casse. qu'il y a. Vas-y, barre-toi, là, les flics qui vont... S'il vous plaît, Manon.
Balance les pompes. Je t'ai dit balance-moi les pompes.
Tu m'as pas dit balance-moi les pompes. Ben, fallait dire balance-moi les pompes, t'as pas dit ça.
En ce moment, j'ai l'impression que je déraille complètement.
Comme ça, mais j'ai une petite expérience dans tout ce qui déraille.
Tu bosses, tu envoies de l'argent au pays, et puis t'as tout le temps peur de te faire attraper.
Non, arrête.
J'ai peur un jour d'oublier qui je suis.
Si un jour t'oublies, t'auras qu'à crier ton prénom. Comme ça, les gens y croiront que t'as envie de danser.
Okay. So you can see that he's actually become African in Samba. He's not African, of course. He's grown up in France, with Marseille, born in France, but there he's got this kind of exaggerated accent, and we have the encoding of a broadly comic screenplay with that social realist elements as well, in terms of iconography and also details of plot. So rather cliched. On the other hand, arguably having any black actors in a main role in French cinema is already positive. Interestingly, almost the majority of the highest paid comedians in French cinema are North African, including Danny Boone. So he's very pale, but he's actually part Algerian, alongside people like Jamel Debbouze and Gad Elmaleh pictured there. However, Sy is the only black actor in this superstar category. This identity is more of a problem, quote unquote, as examined, for instance, by Régis Dubois in his book Les Noirs dans le cinéma français. So you don't very often get unmarked roles for the black actors in the way that you now do with second and third generation North African immigrants. It's interesting in Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait au bon Dieu that the black identity is structured as the punchline, right? As if it wasn't bad enough that these people are already married to various ethnic minorities. Now one of the daughters is going to marry a black one is kind of the subtext. Furthermore, all these actors come from stand-up comedy, which is a particular tradition whereby, of course, they tend to take details of previous performances over into future roles, including their film roles, and in some sense, they're playing themselves, perhaps, or at least a kind of established persona. It tends to attract viewers who like the performer, in particular, comedian comedy, as it's often called, and know what they're going to see. And you can get a sense of Sy's persona from images of him in the show where he cut his teeth, Service après-vente des émissions, on Canal+ between 2005 and 2012. Ginette Vincent points out, actually, that David Peterson's article, interesting though it is, it's taking a very Anglo-American point of view, and viewers watching Intouchable in France would have a completely different reference sphere from those in the USA who don't know Omar Sy. So they're arguably interacting in a very different way with the character, and you could say that his pre-existing recognizability as a stand-up comic, even one whose Africanness is visibly played up in those images on the screen, suggests the extent to which he may be actually authoring his own image and performance in ways that imply we aren't so much laughing at as with him, giving him a certain discursive power. Just to close, a final image, one of many showing his cultural status now. In fact, Sy was voted the most popular person in France 2 years running, in 2015 and 2016, according to the newspaper Journal du Dimanche. While, as I've said, she's joining the career ranks of other top comedians there. So I think we have to conclude by acknowledging that his stardom overall is a positive development and a sign of representational progress for multicultural France, if still somewhat tenuous. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was so interesting, and thank you for peppering